Hello and greetings from a somewhat storm-battered UK. I'm looking nervously out the window here. My name's David Price, and Jono asked me to share some thoughts with you as we nervously pop our heads round the door marked pandemic and look for the handle of the door marked endemic, if we should be so lucky. Now, I should start by apologising if the edits on this become apparent. We've got 4 major storms coming into the Yorkshire Dales. I'm in North Yorkshire here in a place called North Rigton. And we've got 4 storms in the next 2 days. So when it gets too windy, recording just becomes impossible. I'm going to show you what it looks like at the moment out of my office window. So Jono gave me a list of things to try and cover, but let's start with the final item on his list. He said, can you do some recommendations for principals drowning in COVID administration? And I can't, because I honestly have nothing to offer but admiration and deep respect. When I was training to be an educator, like the rest of you, administering your school's response to a global pandemic, funnily enough, it wasn't on the curriculum. So I don't know how you're coping, but I do know many principals in England who are just running on fumes. So all I can offer as a keen student of Omicron is the hope that we're coming to the end of this nightmare, until the next one comes along at least. But moving confidently forward is the key to how we'll emerge from this thriving, not just surviving. And I do have some thoughts to share on that. I'll come back to the long-term consequences of COVID at the end, but I want to start with what I think is hands down the most important function of global education systems for at least the next 3 decades. And that is how to give our students a sense of agency. By that I mean the belief that they can reshape the world, because let's face it, they're going to have to. As I record this talk, there is global speculation that Russia will attack at precisely 1 o'clock tomorrow morning. That's Wednesday UK time. It's less predictable booking a taxi. But who knows? Even if war is averted, where's it all going to end up? And in the US, democracy's having to fight for its right to exist. Gerrymandering, disinformation met with little more than a shrug of the shoulders. And the UK isn't far behind. We've got mass migration from the global south. It's only going to increase as the earth heats up and the inequality gap gets even wider. And we seem to have no plan to address it other than stop the boats. And you don't need me to tell you guys about the climate emergency. One of the last things we saw in Australia, this time 2 years ago, was to drive for an hour and a half through the scorched Blue Mountains. And at the time, it was a very big deal until COVID came along. But the climate will continue to deteriorate long after we've forgotten what a lateral flow test is. So the only people who can fix all of these existential crises are sitting in your classrooms right now. So I'd argue that a curriculum and pedagogy that doesn't empower them to be citizens of change, to be social entrepreneurs, to be community builders, it's not just condemning our young people to a life of learned helplessness. It's also an act of self-sabotage on our behalf. And of course, in Brexit Britain, we know all about self-sabotage. This will become very depressing very soon. So let's focus on the positives. We know the young people have the capability and the moral compass to make change happen. As I never tire of telling people, the 2 largest public demonstrations in the history of our species were organised by a bunch of school kids. That was the March for Our Lives protest, which was led by the Parkland students who witnessed that horrific mass shooting. And you probably have students who took part in the school strike for climate. Here is a movement that began with a single Swedish girl sitting outside Parliament in August 2019, and a year later, 4 million young people had been mobilised. So they know a thing or two about organising. And what I found most telling during the depressing Glasgow COP26 was the comment from Greta when she was marching in the streets around the conference centre. A journalist asked her, why was she inside trying to get her case across? She said, why would it be inside? She said, it's pointless, it's just blah, blah, blah. The real action is here, on the streets. And that's kind of what worries me the most. There's a kind of cognitive dislocation going on, and we're not doing anything about it. If young people appear apathetic to you, it's because we keep asking them to change the world, but only on our terms. You know, we say run as an MP, even while they can see governments are trashing representative democracies everywhere. Now, I had first-hand experience of this cognitive dislocation when I was rewriting The Power of Us, and I had to rewrite it when I got back from Australia 2 years ago, in the light of the amazing response that I saw. I saw pop-up self-help groups all over the world. I described it as communities outperforming bureaucracies. Thousands of scrub hub groups making PPE, kids making face shields, when governments like ours squandered £10 billion buying masks and face shields that were already out of date. I saw a 17-year-old kid from Seattle who achieved in 3 days what the UK government wasted millions of pounds and took months to screw up and never got to the market. Avi Schiffman was his name, and he built a COVID tracking website so effective that Anthony Fauci still goes to it when he needs authoritative data. And it won Avi the Webby Person of the Year. That's an award which is like the Oscars for coders. But when I asked Avi where he was going to go to college, he said, probably nowhere. Because his GPA, which in the US is the equivalent of ATAR, was 1.7 out of a possible 4. And I said, Avi, you don't want to even consider a college that will put your test scores ahead of your social entrepreneurship. But even as I was saying it, I wondered if anybody would be brave enough to waive the entry requirements for this extremely bright young man. Well, in the end, he got offered a place at Harvard, so it's all worked out for him. But I can't help but wonder how many more Avis have been turned away by universities through simply not knowing their full range of skills and dispositions because they didn't show up on the transcript. And this is where I want to pay tribute here to John O, who, when he was at Woodley, had the foresight to support the work of the Mastery Transcript Consortium. This is an organisation that I'm proud to be an advisor to. I've been arguing long and hard that the Mastery Transcript was just one potential alternative / addendum to ATAR to anybody who'd listen. But it was John O and Richard Owens who brought it to Australia. And that's an example of my next question. How on earth do we expect our students to acquire agency if our own teachers don't have it? Over the last 40 years, across all occupations, we've seen a decline in autonomy at work, but it's especially the case in the teaching profession. Here's a few striking stats. Globally, workers have 40% less autonomy than they had 40 years ago. In 10 years' time, only 10 to 15% of workers will have what's known as permission to think. Unless we do something different, we'll start to see the UK's appalling retention rates spread. Just under half of all newly qualified teachers are still in the profession 5 years later. Whichever way you look at it, that's a shocking waste of money, vocation, and training expertise. Of a study of 10 graduate level professions, teaching scored next to bottom for ability to make your own decisions. If there was a ready supply of fresh-faced recruits, that would be one thing. But COVID's provoked what's known as the Great Resignation wave, and the bulk of resignations are in this 30 to 45 age range. And the average age of a teacher is 46. I'll just leave that there. Around the world, recruitment and retention is going to be the #1 challenge for at least the next decade. We're not chasing better salaries, we're chasing happiness and purpose. So if you want to stop your people jumping on the independent school's merry-go-round of changing places, work on your culture, not your perks, your pay, your promises. The challenge for schools is that they're largely built upon a culture of compliance, externally dictated mainly by regulatory bodies, when if they're to keep talent in the profession, they should be built upon a culture of innovation. My big realization in researching innovative organizations around the world is that they didn't try to impose or mandate culture or innovation. They realized that if you got the culture right, innovation would surely follow as night follows day. It's at this point that I want to pay tribute to the Future Schools Alliance, which is based in Melbourne and led by Peter Hutton and Jen Buchanan. Because in a sea of compliance, they're encouraging schools to take the road less travelled and to encourage educators to become learning designers again. Fair play to them. Now, after I wrote a book, a few of us founded a Power of Us agency, and we're committed to help organisations make work enjoyable, fulfilling and purposeful. The first tool that we created was our cultural audit, and this is a bottom-up reflection of the actual culture of the organisation, not the one that the CEO says that they have. It's built upon the 8 key elements of a healthy, innovative culture that you're seeing on the screen right now. The problem, you see, for most schools is summarised in this clip by Mark Morehouse, one of a growing number of school CEOs that's using our cultural audit tool.
I see senior leaders and CEO working so hard creating strategies, working till the small hours thinking, okay, here's our strategy, I must communicate it effectively, everyone must deliver the strategy and then we'll get quality. What are you doing? It's a virtuous error. No one's as smart as all of us. So go with lean principles. Go, look, I think this is the direction of travel. These are the kinds of things we can do. Go with something. Don't go with nothing. That's profligate. You're paid as a CEO, you're paid as a senior leader. Go with some thinking, but invite other people into that. And there's a kind of piñata effect on some strategies, because if you invite everyone to critique them, well, they'll either survive or not. And if they don't survive, how lucky was that you didn't set off with them? There's not worse than getting your own way if it's the wrong idea. You can get wonderful strategies that are pristine quality and clear and measurable, and they don't work because people don't get them, they don't understand them, they don't feel ownership, they just feel the pressure of failure around them. So yeah, there's ice and there's water. When the goldfish are talking about improving the bowl, they'll talk about the gravel, they'll talk about that plant, that little stone arch, move out. They don't talk about the water, they can't see it because they're in it. And Power of Us survey looks at the water, which is invisible to you. And what came out of that beautifully was about decision making. What jumped out for me was the one about who makes the decisions around here, and the 5th option was that I had no idea. That's really powerful. A lot of people tick that. Whoa, so they are not getting a sense of being involved. Well, the first thing I did is we have an annual training day in October, and I do a CEO address and all the employees in the trust watch it. I had to reference the survey. Don't ask people searching authentic questions and then pretend you didn't. You're joking. So even though we didn't have the answers, I spoke about some headlines about the results. And there's always things that affirm there, the quality of relationships, equality issues. So there's plenty to say, look, we're doing really well. But it's almost that 5 and 2 ratio. Talk about what's really well, but you got to get to it. And so I said, only out of the 6 sites, only one of the sites felt that they were included in decision making.
So few schools actually know what the culture is, because to do so would mean asking everyone involved in the endeavour, students, staff, governors, parents, communities. So it's easier just to stick a few motivational posters up around the building instead. But motivational posters don't cut it anymore in a post-COVID reality. We've all been changed by the experience, and we're not going to be easily fobbed off. This takes us to the new demands upon leaders. The old ego-driven models of leadership died along with Delta, and we're in a landscape where, to quote Sparks and Honey, it's another organisation that I advise, you're not the leader anymore, your people are. One of the finest learning environments that I visited in writing The Power of Us wasn't a college or a school, it was WD-40 in San Diego. And Gary Ridge, who hails from Five Docks in Sydney, leads one of the most iconic brands in the world. And he neatly described the shift that we're seeing, which has been accelerated by COVID, but was already there to begin with.
That approach is very, very different to you've got a CEO sitting in the office with you called Al, who's a doll who represents kind of the worst of CEO cliches in a way, the worst of humanity in many ways. Are you looking for him now?
Yeah. I got him here.
Trying to bring him on. Can you grab him?
Yeah, there he is.
Now, we're fascinated at Power of Us with sort of cultural development. Now, Al represents an old school type of CEO, but we're seeing the rise of people like yourself who are focused on humanity, vulnerability, compassion in a way that perhaps they weren't before. Do you think this is a passing phase, or do you think Al's had his day and he's truly gone?
I believe for 20 some years that it's our job as leaders to create a place where people go to work every day. They make a contribution to something bigger than themselves. They learn something new. They're protected and set free by a compelling set of values, and they go home happy. So we've believed this for over 20 years, and that's the servant leadership that we have been exercising through the whole leadership of the company. I've been very critical of the owls for many years. And I'm hoping, if I had one main hope out of COVID, is that the hard-headed owls would get the message.
WD-40 has employee engagement rates in excess of 95%. The global average is about 30%. And their retention rates actually went up during COVID. And this is how Gary explained it.
And, everybody's been through their own personal hero's journey as we've come through this. And I think, again, the research that you recently did where it talks about empathy and understanding and connection, and, we have to go the extra mile now to really ensure that we're showing people that they do have a place, they do belong. One of the biggest desires we have as human beings is to belong. We've all left a party, a company, or even a relationship, but because we didn't feel like we belonged. And that's why we call ourselves a tribe, not a team. So the other thing that I think is interesting is, as we talk about the return to the next, what might be normal, because it's not going to be normal. When COVID happened, it was like a light switch, turn it off. Mm-hmm. Coming back, it's like a dimmer switch. We have to turn it up a little bit and turn it down a little bit, turn it up a little bit, because if we turned on the bright light again, it would startle people because they've been through this personal hero's journey that we're unsure of. The person I said, see you Monday morning to in March a year ago is not the same person I saw at the front door the other day when I was handing out Krispy Kreme donuts for the people who had decided to come back in, and I was welcoming them to the TP. So you have to take the time to ask some really simple questions. How are you? How's life? Have you been okay? What's new with you? What have you learned? How can we support each other better?
And so to finish on a high, here's some of the people who are not just finding ways to reshape the purpose of learning, but they're also responding empathetically to the challenges that we're facing in a post-pandemic future. First one is the Liger Leadership Academy. It's an independent selective school. Initially was based in Cambodia, but we've also got a school in New Zealand now. And they get outstanding test scores by doing work that matters to the community and to the country. And every year, the students in Cambodia have to write an essay answering the question, how have I changed Cambodia this year? Imagine the sense of agency we'd build if that was the key metric rather than standardized test scores. Or there's Hilltop Road Public School in Merrylands, New South Wales. It's run by a visionary principal, a woman called Natalie C., who sees her role as restoring community as much as educating toddlers. They've got an adult learning centre on the same site as their classrooms. They're training mothers to become community advocates. They're breaking down stereotypical attitudes towards migrants, and it all started with an ask. Instead of the usual one-way incoming support from community groups like the RSL clubs, she said, "But what can we do for you?" Now, because of lockdown, I've not visited Hilltop Road in 2 years, but I know they'll have done amazing things for the parents, and vice versa. It's just baked into the philosophy. And then there's the London Interdisciplinary School, which is breaking the mould of higher education. Because students don't register here on a degree course, they sign up to fix a wicked problem, like how do we put an end to malaria, or how do we solve the problems associated with mass migration? And in the future, I honestly believe most universities will look like LIS. And then finally, New Road School in Santa Monica. It calls itself a private school with a public heart. And in its own way, it's breaking the model of independent schooling, because almost half of its students come from the sons and daughters of movie tycoons, rock bands, tech entrepreneurs. But those students are paying for the other half to attend. And these are kids from some of the most deprived districts in California, like Compton or Watts. Kids like this.
When day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? The loss we carry, a sea we must wade. We've braved the belly of the beast. We've learned that quiet isn't always peace. In the norms and notions of what just isn't always just is. And yet the dawn is hours before we knew it. Somehow we do it. Somehow we've weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken, but simply unfinished. We, the successors of a country and a time where a skinny black girl descended from slaves and raised by a single mother can dream of becoming president, only to find herself reciting for one.
New Roads has a wonderful principal, Luther Williams, and the assistant is a Melbourneian, Mark Vickers-Willis, and both of whom I last saw when this photograph was taken at the Mandela exhibition in Melbourne. I'm sure you all went to it. And they've created a petri dish in New Roads in which the experiment of the more perfect union, a country of equality and diversity, could be played out. So all of the students are like Amanda Gorman. They're social activists, they're artists, they're deep, deep thinkers. Okay, so here's the wrap up. COVID has blown away so many myths that we previously accepted as truth. That it took 10 years to develop an effective vaccine. That all organizations were built upon everyone being present 5 days a week. Or that online learning was an ineffective substitute for face-to-face. Or that our governments knew what was best for us. Or that leaders had to lead from the front and good employees would dutifully follow behind. See, the big themes like social justice, diversity and equality are important, but they're not seen as the business of schools. But however tempting, we can't go back to the life before COVID. Let's be honest, it was a life that didn't work for many, perhaps the majority of our students. So why would it be any better now? And nor should we want to go back. Too many people have died, and too many opportunities have presented themselves for us to squander this moment. At the time of a previous global crisis, which was the global financial crisis in 2009, Rahm Emanuel was Chief Secretary of the US Treasury, and he said, "Never let a serious crisis go to waste." But it was the next part that's hardly ever remembered, and yet it's far more profound. Because it's an opportunity to do things you didn't think you could do before. And that's what I'd urge you to do in this calendar year. Challenge yourself not to go back to the comfort of before. Instead, focus upon what your school can become. There are communities all over the world, and that includes Australia, that are going to need rebuilding after this pandemic. So why should schools be well-meaning, detached bystanders in this process? Why shouldn't they be right at the heart of that rebuilding? Why can't we rethink schools and the communities in the way that Natalie C. or Luther Williams have done? All it takes is the commitment to empower, not just engage parents, in co-creating an education worth having in the wake of a pandemic. It means looking out, not in, and it means having the humility to ask, how can we help? Not, how can you help us? It means gaining the confidence and support of students and parents so that you can consider an innovation on its own merits, rather than how it can boost ATAR or IB scores. And finally, it means rethinking the primary function of school so that we can all share the same driving force that I see whenever I visit XP schools in Doncaster in Yorkshire. This is a place where they changed the school motto to something that is so appropriate in a post-COVID reality. It's simply, above all, compassion. Thank you for your time. I know how busy you all are, but if you want to learn anything more about the cultural audit or the tools or the Power of Us toolkit that's coming out, please contact me at david@thepowerofusAgency.com. Thanks very much for listening.